Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, NATO says the use of a newly developed hypersonic ballistic missile by Russia does not change the course of the conflict in Ukraine. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un warns of a nuclear war, suggesting that talks with the United States have reached a dead end. International Criminal Court member states grapple with responding to the court's latest war crimes allegations against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which Israel calls absurd, Washington calls outrageous. And the veteran prosecutor Pam Bondi is President-elect Donald Trump's new pick for Attorney General, replacing Matt Gaetz, who stepped down amidst looming sexual allegations. Hello and welcome. We're going to begin with the rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine, where NATO has said that Moscow's use of an experimental missile will not deter its allies from supporting Ukraine or change the course of the conflict. Well, early on Thursday, Moscow launched a medium-range hypersonic ballistic missile called Oreshnik. It was launched on Dnipro in Ukraine. Well, the launch has stirred concerns of a wider conflict. Well, the missile that hit the Ukrainian city was initially thought to be an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, but was later downgraded to an IRBM, or interrange ballistic missile. Well, Oreshnik is thought to be able to strike Europe and parts of the United States. It can reportedly travel 10 times the speed of sound and carry nuclear warheads if needed. Well, the Kremlin says that it warned the US about the strike prior to the launch and justifies its use of this type of weapon on the grounds that the US is allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS to target Russia. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the former NATO commander, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, who joins us now from London. Dr. Parry, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Some are saying that Russia's use of a hypersonic ballistic missile in Dnipro carried some sort of a message. What do you think the message was, and who do you think was the intended recipient?
Well, there's no doubt that it's both a political and military message. I think we should clarify that pretty much all ballistic missiles are hypersonic because they come down very fast. The key point is that President Putin and the Russian regime is saying, look, I can do this on Dnipro, I can do it on any European capital or indeed some cities of the United States. And it's essentially political signaling, saying I can do this, I can do it at a time and place of my own choice, and it's up to you. He's engaged in a very high level, a game of poker at the moment, and he's trying to outbid essentially what the West is doing in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, we've spoken to Ukrainians this week who've said that this is all a sort of a psychological dimension to the conflict. Would you agree with that?
There's no question about that. The fact that the Russians warned the Americans beforehand that this wasn't the start of either a nuclear or a mass conventional ballistic missile attack is an indicator of that signaling. It is performative, there's no question about that. Both sides right now in the conflict are trying to lock in their gains ahead of President Trump getting into the White House in January, and this is part of that pattern.
There are going to be some talks in Brussels on Tuesday, NATO-Ukraine talks. They're going to be talking about this Dnipro attack. How united and how resolute would you say that NATO is looking at this particular moment?
I think NATO as a whole is extremely united. I don't think there's any space between what the Americans and what the Europeans think. I mean, some of our European allies in NATO tend slightly towards sympathy towards Russia. But in that sense, I think in terms of common defense, NATO countries are absolutely united in opposition. I think any country in NATO can see what's happened to Ukraine. Thousands of missiles have been fired against civilian infrastructure, military targets, and also the civilian population. They don't want that happening in Western Europe. And anything they can do to deplete or indeed deter Russian capability is going to be welcome across the whole spectrum of membership, I would suggest.
We heard from the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, saying that if Russia is allowed to get away with this, i.e. Take large swathes of Ukraine without consequences, then, quote, it won't stop there. What do you think he's getting at here? Do you think Russia really does have territorial ambition beyond Ukraine?
And there's no doubt, if you look back at the Russian history of the last 100 years, they're particularly sensitive about the Baltic and the Black Seas, and part of their strategic purpose in taking over Crimea in 2014 and going into the eastern Donbass region in 2022 was really to try and dominate the Black Sea. They miscalculated in the Baltic, of course, because Sweden and Finland immediately joined NATO. And there's no doubt that should Russia either freeze the campaign in Ukraine through peace talks, or indeed prevail in Ukraine, they will next turn their attention to the Baltic. And I suspect the Baltic states and Sweden and Finland will come under severe pressure. And there's no coincidence in the fact that the subsea cables between Finland and Sweden and Lithuania and Germany were cut this last week. That's a warning to them in advance that they might be next in the firing line.
And you were mentioning the advent of Donald Trump in just under 2 months from now. And I'm just wondering what you think NATO and NATO allies are trying to get done before he does take office. Because it does look, doesn't it, like they're sort of trying to get various things in order before he returns to the White House. And I'm just wondering what you think specifically they want to have set in stone before he does.
Well, I think President Biden has taken away one of the bargaining tools that President Trump could have used, and that is the extension of the use of these ATACMS and the Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom. And so I think President Biden's dying regime is going to have to be very careful that it doesn't remove the very tools of persuasion that President Trump's administration afterwards will want to use in relation to Russia. I think one thing that we do need to be aware of is that Russia's economy next year will start to bite at the Russian people quite hard. If you look at inflation, you look at the unemployment levels, which are down because obviously they haven't got the manpower to service some of their industries. And you look at the interest rates, which are up at 23% at the moment, you can see that economic difficulties are coming pretty hard and fast for the Russian regime. If you have a significant drop in oil prices, for example, then that really will squeeze Russia very hard because they're sustaining the war very much on the export of oil right now, and that oil that is resold back to other countries.
Yeah, we understand that, in fact, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, is paying a visit to Florida today to talk to Donald Trump. What do you imagine the nature of their conversation to be?
Well, I suspect that the Secretary General will want to say to President Trump, look, we heard what you said before you were elected president again. I appreciate that a lot of that was possibly performative for your internal audience, but here is the reality on the ground in Europe, and this is what it will mean for the United States. Therefore, we need to have a coordinated strategy here between the United States and the rest of NATO. Russia is a threat. There are not just threats to Ukraine, but to the broader European security structure. How can we work together will be, I think, the message.
You mentioned that Storm Shadow missiles have been used now in Russia by the Ukrainians. And we heard from the Russian ambassador to London, whose name is Andrei Kaelin, who says that the UK is now directly involved as a consequence of that. Is your understanding, therefore, based on what the Russian ambassador to London has said, that Britain is now in a state of war with Russia?
Well, I'm in London. It doesn't feel like we're in a state of war with Russia. I'm afraid we're used to the Putin regime and its representatives huffing and puffing. You know, we don't scare easily in the United Kingdom, to tell you the truth. And we know this is performative. We're not directly involved in Ukraine. We are simply helping a democratic country that 2 years ago was attacked by an autocratic neighbor that has committed war crimes, that has devastated quite a lot of the country and shows no signs of showing any restraint.
So it sounds like you would dismiss the comments that were made to this channel by Sergei Markov, who is a spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, that British people could very well be spending their Christmases in bomb shelters.
Well, Tom, we've been threatened by dictators before, and I'm afraid to say that the British people, when confronted by things like that, simply say, well, we can do the same to you. Right now, we have a ballistic missile submarine with 16 Trident missiles in the North Atlantic. If he wants to try our patience, I'm sure that both conventionally and in nuclear terms, we can outface a dictator like Putin and his regime.
The British Foreign Secretary David Lammy and his French counterpart Jean-Noël Barrot wrote in a newspaper piece together saying, "We will do everything necessary to help Ukraine combat Russia." How important do you see that partnership as being in this particular context?
The British and the French are probably the two leading military powers in Europe, so that counts a lot. But in these circumstances, words are really easy, aren't they? I think what we've got to notice is what is really being done on the ground in terms of actions and how well supported Ukraine feels. I think right now Ukraine feels it needs to get all the support it can get. The campaign at the moment is on a knife edge. I don't think Ukraine can win the war in terms of getting its territory back. And unless we stabilize the situation right now, Ukraine will continue to bleed, and Russians will continue to throw Russian corpses at the problem. It's not a war we want in Europe, and it's disrupting both the economy and also the human rights of people throughout Europe if this conflict continues.
And all this comes at a time when the British government's talking about belt tightening in the Defense Ministry. I mean, isn't that a cause for concern that the British government should be thinking about cutting expenditure, or at least finding economies in the Defense Ministry at a time when it would appear their preparedness is more important than at any other time in perhaps recent memory?
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, during the Cold War, defense expenditure was 5.2% of GDP. It's barely 2% of GDP at the moment. And as you say, we had the announcement of some measures this week, which I have to say are largely rationalization measures. And they don't deplete our capability that much, except in the case of a couple of Royal Navy tankers. The key point is that we need any savings invested in future capability and the latest technology. I have a suspicion at the moment there is a level of strategic illiteracy amongst this new government. They don't seem to be able to listen to the experts, and they don't coordinate with our allies how best to deter aggression and coercion against ourselves and also against the members of the alliance.
And just lastly, I mean, supposing the Trump administration says this is a European problem, I'm talking about the conflict with Ukraine here, Europe can therefore deal with it on its own. Do you think Ukraine would be able to survive with purely European support, or do you think that's an unlikely scenario?
I think it's an unlikely scenario because I think President Trump and the people around him, some of whom I'm familiar with, will know that if that were to be said, then the whole NATO alliance would fracture. It's not possible to separate the security of the United States and Europe in the current circumstances. Their opponents are strategic players, there's no question about that, that can have global military influence. So if Europe isn't supporting the United States not supporting Europe, then President Putin will get what he wants for Christmas, and that is a fracturing of the NATO alliance. It's the most successful military political alliance in history, and it shouldn't be thrown away lightly.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed for your time today, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Thank you very much indeed. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is warning that the risk of nuclear war is growing, and he is blaming the United States for stoking the tensions. Well, Kim says that talks with the US are at a dead end because, he says, it's clear that their hostility won't change. Well, it's worth recalling that the US President-elect Donald Trump did meet with his North Korean counterpart during his first term in office. They met 3 times, although no concrete outcomes were achieved. Well, to discuss this matter further, we're joined now by Dennis Wilder, who is the former CIA Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Al Arabiya News. North Korea is saying that the risk of nuclear war has never been greater, blames the United States for ramping up tensions. Is this just rhetoric, do you think?
Well, I think you have to put it into context. First of all, Kim is feeling emboldened by his new relationship with Putin. They signed a mutual defense treaty this summer. And so he feels he now has the kind of international support that he hasn't had in years. The Chinese really never gave him this kind of support. There are new reports today that Putin has given him long-range S-400 surface-to-air missiles. So some of this is posturing because he feels he can now that he has an important backer.
So you don't think the West should necessarily be too fearful of this latest rhetoric from Pyongyang?
I don't. And remember, he's also talking past Biden to Trump. So when he says that negotiations are at a dead end, what he's saying is that he was very frustrated by the Biden administration, by their diplomacy, and he's expecting something different from Trump. So I actually take this as a message to Trump that this situation is critical, but that he actually wants to see what Trump might do again with North Korea.
Yeah, of course, Donald Trump, one of very few world leaders to have shaken the hand of Kim Jong-un and set foot in his country even. I mean, what do you think the nature of their relationship is? And do you think that Donald Trump has what it takes to somehow hold some rational, meaningful conversations with Kim Jong-un during his second term in office?
Well, having negotiated with the North Koreans over decades, I can tell you that there is nothing more difficult than dealing with the North Koreans and dealing with Kim. However, I think Trump was creative the last time around. I think the Biden administration has been extremely uncreative in dealing with the North Koreans. And I think the North Korean leader would be intrigued by a new round of talks. Trump is transactional, and autocratic leaders appreciate that. He isn't particularly ideological. He isn't particularly interested in trying to convert the North Koreans to democracy. He just would like to see a better situation on the peninsula. So I think there's room here, but we'll just have to see.
So you're saying that there is something that can be built on from those ties dating back to the first Trump administration that can be built upon during the second administration?
Well, Trump keeps talking about the beautiful letters he received from Kim. In fact, he tried to keep them, much to the chagrin of the National Archives. But yes, I think that with Trump, he has a certain amount of rapport with autocratic leaders, for better or worse. So he felt he connected with Putin. He felt he connected with Xi Jinping. He felt he connected with Kim. So I think he would be inclined to trying again at some point.
You mentioned the defense pact between Pyongyang and Moscow. Obviously, ties between the two countries, Russia and North Korea, looking stronger now than they have done in several decades. And I'm just wondering what you think is in it for North Korea, having such strong ties at this particular moment,
yes.
and obviously helping, I should add, Russia in its war effort in Ukraine.
Right. There's a huge amount in it for Kim. I've already talked about international stature, but the North Koreans have a very backward military other than these nuclear missiles. The Chinese have not been willing to help them with sensitive technology. Putin has all kinds of things that the North Koreans would love to have. For example, ballistic missile submarines, high-performance stealth fighter aircraft, tactical nuclear weapons technology, more technology to build ICBMs with multiple reentry vehicles. The list is long and scary. And frankly, on the US side, people are very worried about what he might be getting, how this might embolden Kim. So Kim sending soldiers and artillery and drones, this is a small price for him to pay to get a high dividend if Putin is willing.
Yeah, the only thing we know for sure the North Koreans have received from the Russians was a shipment of zoo animals that arrived this week. I gather there was a lion, some bears, and some parrots that were delivered to Pyongyang Zoo by Russia this week. In terms of what difference...
You're ahead of me on that, Tom. I haven't read that intelligence.
Yeah, it's out there, and the pictures are there as well of some fine animals being delivered to Pyongyang. But I just want to ask you what sort of a difference you think the North Koreans are managing to make on the battlefield.
You know, 10,000 troops isn't going to make a significant difference. And frankly, North Korean troops aren't that special or elite that I think they will make a huge difference. I do think that they will get a great deal out of it going into combat, understanding modern warfare, modern drone warfare in a way you can only understand it on the battlefield. So I think their officers will get a lot. I would expect they'll rotate in units, that this will just be the first contingent, and they will get a great deal of learning off of this.
And of course, they're an extremely disciplined army. We've been looking at pictures of them goose-stepping on the screen as you've been talking. And they're also used to working in hostile climates. I mean, North Korea is extremely cold in the winter. I mean, do you think those two things will come into play and perhaps give the Russian troops an important boost?
I think in that way, yes. These will be elite troops of North Korea. We know they are part of what a unit is called Storm, which are basically, the old term for it was sappers, but special forces. And so they will be much better troops than the raw recruits that, and cannon fodder, frankly, that Putin has put into the front lines. So I would expect their performance on the battlefield to be higher than Russian troops.
What do you think China makes of all of this? Because, of course, China just this week has been calling, not once but twice, for restraint and calm in Ukraine, calling on all parties. China's never condemned the war, but having to walk a bit of a tightrope, isn't it, with the West and Russia? I'm just wondering whether perhaps there's scope for some friction between Beijing and Beijing and Moscow, having Russia now making use of North Korean soldiers in Ukraine.
Yes, I think you've put your finger on it. The Chinese have never commented on this new mutual defense pact between Russia and North Korea. They have not said a word in their media about the North Korean troops going to the Ukraine. In my discussions with Chinese officials, they're very nervous about all this. They don't have information. The Russians and the North Koreans are keeping information with them on the relationship. They're in fact asking us, what do we know? And so I think this lowers China's leverage with the North Koreans. That's a problem. The Chinese, while they don't mind having a bit of a threatening North Korea against Japan and South Korea, they don't want war. And they don't want Kim to get emboldened to the point that he starts a war. After all, the last time the North Koreans started a war, the Chinese lost 1 million men in combat. They do not want to be dragged into something on the Korean Peninsula.
No, they certainly don't want, I'd have thought, North Korea being handed sophisticated weaponry, especially weaponry that could give their own arsenal quite a significant boost.
Absolutely. I have, in fact, written, and I believe that this would be a good idea for the United States and intelligence channels to try and work with the Chinese on this question. I think they might be open to this.
So you're saying there's an opportunity here?
I see an opportunity in this situation.
And do you see it as an opportunity that the Trump administration is likely to seize?
I think they are more, shall we say, geopolitically realistic than the Biden administration, and therefore I do think they might seize the opportunity. There are opportunities to drive a wedge between Putin and Xi Jinping. Remember that there's a long history of the Russians, from the Chinese point of view, acting against their interests. In the 1950s, the Russians were very close to the Chinese, did a lot for them. But by 1960, that relationship had fallen apart. The Russians weren't willing to give the Chinese nuclear weapons technology. The new Russian leader, Khrushchev, did not have the kind of relationship with Mao, and they remember all of this. They feel a certain amount of Russian racism toward China. So I am not convinced that the Russia-China axis is invulnerable to our disruption.
Do you think that North Korea is a good ally for Russia to have in terms of Russia's own credibility on the world stage? Because, I mean, there aren't very many countries like North Korea in the world, are there?
No, I think there's a certain amount of desperation on the part of Putin. I think he's frustrated with his own soldiers. As I said, he's putting very raw recruits into the front lines, and they haven't performed well. So I think this is a bit of a Hail Mary by Putin to get North Korean troops into the front lines. So no, I don't think this helps Putin's position that much, but he doesn't have a lot of options either.
Okay, just lastly, with regards to the war in Ukraine, I'm just wondering whether you think that North Korea suddenly getting involved, and this is something that we've heard people saying this week, was perhaps something of a red line for some of the Western powers that support Ukraine, and therefore one of the reasons why permission was given rather late in the day, many would say, for advanced weaponry to be used by the Ukrainians. Do you see a connection here? Do you think that perhaps North Korea being involved was sort of the last straw for permission to be given for that kind of weaponry to be used in Ukraine?
I think that's not bad speculation. I would have to say that I was extremely disappointed in the way the Biden administration has acted on these issues. I think that it is irresponsible to have denied Ukraine these kinds of capabilities for, 2 years. If they had thought this was a good idea, they should have done it long ago. So I'm a bit confused by this decision-making process. It seems to me that we have been very slow to give the Ukrainians F-16s, tanks, and these long-range missile capabilities.
So it doesn't sound like you're seeing a particular connection with North Korea being a red line that perhaps prompted the Biden administration to make that decision.
I think the Biden administration has done this because they're worried that Trump will make a deal with Putin, and they're trying to put as much capability on the ground with the Ukrainians before Trump comes in as possible.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Dennis Wilder, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the invitation.
The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also for his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Well, this news has triggered mixed reactions from around the world. The Biden administration in Washington called it outrageous. Israel has called it absurd. Well, in Europe, Germany says it is working on a response. Meanwhile, Europe's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, insists that the ICC decision must be respected. Meanwhile, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has taken a different position, saying that Netanyahu is welcome in his country. Well, for more, we can speak now to Sir Stephen O'Brien, former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, who joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us, Sir Stephen. Let's start by talking about this ICC warrant. It says that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant committed crimes against humanity and war crimes. Do you agree with this decision to issue this warrant? And have they, in your view, committed the crimes of which they're accused?
Well, speaking from the United Kingdom, which is a signatory to the treaties that set up the ICC, obviously we recognise as the United Kingdom, I don't speak for the government, but that the ICC has both legitimacy and a standing in world affairs. It's a court which is wholly independent of member states and member state influence, and is entitled to examine any kind of charges or accusations made to it and information brought to its attention, and then it carries out its own investigation. And it issues warrants for the arrest where it believes there is sufficient evidence of a potential crime under the international rules. So at that stage, any one of us is not in a position to say whether or not we agree with whether they should issue a warrant. It's under their independent processes. They have decided to. The question then is, what does that mean for those who are under that risk of arrest, in order to bring them to a point of being questioned and tried with a view to whether or not the prosecutors would be able to secure any kind of finding of the alleged crimes. So it's at the level of allegation at the moment. It is not by any means any question of proof. So it's a matter of process. So at this stage, I think that those of us who find ourselves either subject to or in jurisdictions where we are signatories to the ICC, I don't think we have any opportunity to have an opinion other than to say the court is doing its work and it must be respected.
Indeed. I mean, it seems to have put some leaders in a tricky position. I mean, just to, since we're talking about the UK, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, saying the UK respects the independence of the ICC. I mean, not going beyond that and not saying that Benjamin Netanyahu would potentially be placed under arrest were he to arrive in the UK.
Well, I haven't heard. I've heard some reports that maybe the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said that there would be a respect for the warrant for the arrests. What that normally means is that if somebody sets foot in a jurisdiction which is a signatory to the treaties that set up the ICC, they would have certain international legal obligations to effect an arrest on behalf of the ICC. So clearly the UK, as part of that, has that. Now we have a difficulty because we all want to see the same standards applied in any case of the ICC, and there have been in the past arrest warrants issued against people for whom we would, none of us, I think, have any quibble whatever. And so I think to apply this consistently is important, even though I think that it is, in this case, very, very difficult because of the conflict of approaches between those who wish to see the international rules-based system respected, that any country living securely within its borders, particularly a democracy, should have the right to defend its citizens against foreign and exterior attacks, which is exactly what Israel has been saying that it's been doing. At the same time, there has been this difficulty in international law of proportionality not necessarily being part of the consideration. So this is a tricky area, whereas it's much easier to identify the sense of potential justice when you look at someone like Putin going as an aggressor over a border as a state against Ukraine, which is another independent state. There you can see how that is much more obvious. So that's why there is this big debate. But I think that in terms of process, those who've signed up to the ICC, which America hasn't, would need to respect the fact that the warrant has been issued, and there are certainly legal obligations that flow from that.
Yeah, yesterday I interviewed somebody in Israel who described the ICC as a kangaroo court, and obviously Israel has been extremely dismissive of these accusations leveled against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. How much support do you think there is for the ICC around the world? Do you think it's a sort of I mean, obviously the countries that have signed up to it, not all of them seem to agree with this decision to accuse those two men of war crimes. Do you think that there is a huge split in the world between those who think the court has legitimacy and those that don't?
Well, yes, it is patchy because not everybody has signed up to it. I mean, I do remember, I happen to have been in the House of Commons as a member of Parliament in the shadow teams at the time, when the question about ratifying our membership of the ICC treaties came up. And of course, there was a big debate about whether we should do that if America was not going to do that. In the end, it was decided that the UK would. But others, such as the United States, have not. It has also meant that when we've had others who've had arrest warrants issued against them, such as the former president of Sudan, for instance, that has restricted their travel, as it has done for Putin. But it's not prevented Putin, for instance, from traveling to South Africa not so long ago, and he wasn't arrested. So there are these inconsistent approaches, and the ICC, which is, as I say, totally independent, it sort of sits in a relationship with the United Nations, but the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is associated with that, whilst there is a reference and a read across to the ICC, there is also a degree of independence. And at the moment, there is a struggle going on, and there's a big debate, which I'm sure you and your viewers are deeply aware of, about the question about whether the rules-based system that was established internationally in the middle of the last century, which has served us pretty well, but has been honoured often in the breach, and then there's been a massive diplomatic effort to try and pull things back from potential conflicts, and it has certainly not stopped conflicts, and recently it's been held in less regard than ever, and its leadership has been called into question. And I think that is all very fair, and I think we have a tussle at the moment. It's about whether the established international rules, which I think we are all living by, and it's very, very important. In my view, I think they are there to be defended and upheld. But there are others who do not believe that and think that it's time to move on to a different approach.
I want to ask you about the humanitarian situation in Gaza in just a moment, for your reading of it. But just one more question on the issue of this ICC ruling, because an arrest warrant was also issued for Mohammed Deif, who is the head of the military wing of Hamas, who's actually believed by many actually to be dead. And I'm just wondering what you think the point is of issuing an arrest warrant for him, if indeed he's no longer alive. Is there some symbolism, do you think, in that?
Well, I think that if the ICC have done whatever investigations they've done in the light of information being provided to them and complaints being made to them, has given them grounds that there is sufficient evidence for them to justify an arrest warrant for anybody for alleged commission of international war crimes, then that would be important that they do then issue that warrant for arrest, because that's the nature of what exactly their purpose is. And unless there is proof of death of a person, then the presumption has to be that they are alive until otherwise proven. I understand that at the moment, the proof of death of the former Hamas leading operative has not been made. So that's why I suspect the ICC has decided to proceed. I imagine it has to be evidence-based. I think the implication behind perhaps your question is, was that done in order to show some kind of balance? Well, I don't believe that could be the right consideration for the ICC. I think they have to be very much what they regard as relevant, applicable, available, admissible evidence-led, that gives them grounds to believe that there is a justification for those warrants against those individuals, and you will have to issue them if unless you know that the person is dead. If once it's clear that person is dead, if that is the case, then that warrant would have to fall away because obviously there's no way of taking it further.
Now, turning our attention to Gaza itself, we're 13 months into the war. 44,056 people have been killed, which is about 36 times the number of people who were killed on the 7th of October. And just talking about Hamas and its leadership there, I mean, yes, indeed, a number of them have been killed, but it seems the group is still highly active and there's a lot of violence and fighting around Beit Lahia in the north of Gaza right now. Why do you think diplomacy has seemingly yielded so few results in bringing this conflict to an end?
Well, like you, I mean, those numbers are absolutely horrifying in terms of the loss of life and the oppression. I think it is not quite appropriate, however much people wish to do so. I don't think it's appropriate in terms of the international diplomatic and legal arrangements to talk about a sort of equivalence between whether or not the number of killed on one side bears relationship to the number killed on another side. This is more to do with the ability of, under the rules that we would expect for borders to be secure, and within that democracies in particular, but also any government, to be able to have the right to defend their citizens and their territory from outside attack, and particularly from non-state actors. And the attack by Hamas on October the 7th, over a year ago, was such an act which required a response under the international rules to defend Israeli territory. So I've been both as horrified as anybody else about the terrible loss of life, the grave, grave difficulty in the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and more recently also in Lebanon as the conflict has spread to the engagement with Hezbollah. And I think there is a need to try and revitalize what has been in my opinion, tremendously benign efforts by Qatar in particular, supported by Egypt, who clearly have a clear interest in being part of the southern border of the Gaza Strip, where there were all those tunnels and the difficulties about people and movements, both vehicular and people, into Gaza and out of Gaza. But Qatar acting very much as an objective dialogue and understanding builder to try and find a way to ease the quite important recognition that a state has a right to defend its borders and its citizens. So that was going very well until very recently, when Qatar has felt compelled to withdraw from that engagement, partly because they were not getting the support they needed from other players. I don't know the inside story on that, but it is clear that they would have pursued it for as long as they felt there was any kind of possibility. So at the moment, there is an absence of any kind of dialogue that could lead to a cessation of hostilities and peace. There have been a few interruptions in order to get some vaccines delivered, very importantly, and occasional humanitarian deliveries, but clearly not enough. And it's a dire situation, but Israel is determined through its forces to pursue the terrorists, to make sure that the threat is removed for any kind of future hostility across into their borders and their territory. So at the moment, the international community, particularly the UN, is not in a position, and it seems unwilling to take the rather higher risk of trying to prevent it.
And would your assessment be that it's unlikely that we'll see any breakthroughs now, given that there are just less than 2 months left of the Biden administration, and that this is probably going to have to wait until Donald Trump is installed at the White House again?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite as starkly as that. I think that the fact that Donald Trump is now the president-elect for a second term as president is having a big influence on people anticipating what may be the direction that he will wish to take and the measures he will wish to seek to apply to either bring about peace, which is what he's declared, that he can do in a day, but we don't know how he thinks that can happen. And And of course, the Biden administration is still very much got the levers of power at the moment, notwithstanding the influence of knowing that will come to an end in a couple of months' time. So they still have opportunities to take decisions and to make big strategic decisions. Their steadfast support of Israel, I don't think, is in doubt. So I think that the question for us is what brings it about best. And there will be a lot of people below the leadership. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, politicians take the decisions and they set policy. But there will be huge numbers of people in the State Department and other departments of the United States administration under the current Democrat-led regime, as well as anticipating what will happen when Donald Trump comes to the presidency again, as there is no doubt in the Foreign Office here in the United Kingdom and in all the foreign ministries who are taking an interest in this around the world. They will be working feverishly to try and find another way forward. And I very much hope might be in a position to re-engage Qatar and its good offices in trying to forge some form of at least temporary cessation of hostilities to give us the space to try and find a way of securing the interests of Israel's citizens, which is ultimately what this is about, against the stated intent of terrorists who wish to remove that security. And that ultimately is what's got to be achieved before we can hope for there to be a peace.
And just lastly, I mean, obviously the UN Security Council had a vote earlier on this week. 14 of the 15 council members voted in favor of this draft resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. One obviously vetoed it, which was the United States. Do you think the United States is starting to look really quite isolated on the world stage with its unconditional, it would seem, support for Israel in a forum like the UN Security Council?
Well, Tom, I wouldn't say it's starting to. I mean, it has always held a very individual and completely uncompromising approach to its support for the state of Israel and for the decisions of the successive governments of Israel in making sure that the people of Israel are secure behind their borders and in the country which the international community made sure was created for the Israelis, for the Jewish state to exist not long after the Second World War. So that has been a big international commitment. The US is absolutely determined we should all stand by. And therefore, when you look at the Security Council, which is charged with the responsibility at the highest diplomatic level of trying to secure peace and security across the world, I think under the current position, and particularly in the way that it's been approached by both the Secretary General as well as the Security Council, I think it's been somewhat less influential and less potent than in previous times. But nonetheless, there has been a difficulty because with the veto, which I have no idea would ever be changed, I can't see what incentive there is for the 5 veto members, including ourselves in the United Kingdom, to give up the veto. And so therefore, you have to build a coalition of consent. And clearly, for as long as the United States perceives that there is an absence of recognition that the state of Israel has a right to defend itself from extraneous attacks, and particularly from those who would wish to see the removal of Israel and the destruction of the state and its people, and who have any kind of sympathy for any of that sentiment of phrases which we all know are now regarded as being very hostile, indeed incitement to hatred. We need to make sure that the compromises that are necessary in UN resolutions come to recognize that the United States is not prepared to compromise on the fundamental right that Israel has a right to defend itself as prescribed by the very UN Charter, which is the terms of reference under which the Security Council itself sits. So that's where the impasse lies, and I think it needs a much more subtle and sensitive approach to the drafting of a resolution so that the United States can find a way to support it, rather than everybody just assume that the United States is in the wrong, which they do have the United Nations Charter and its terms on its side.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. So Stephen O'Brien, thank you very much for your time. The US President-elect Donald Trump has announced that the former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi is his new pick to lead the Department of Justice. Well, Bondi represented him at his first impeachment trial at the Senate in 2019. Well, all this follows on from the withdrawal of ex-Congressman Matt Gaetz, who withdrew 8 days after being named for the role. Well, Bondi and Trump share a years-long political history. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Frank Figliuzzi, who is a former Assistant Director of the FBI and an NBC News Senior National Security Analyst. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Frank. Obviously, Matt Gaetz has withdrawn his name from consideration. I just want to ask you for your reading as to why he's had to do that.
Well, look, there's a number of variables here that combine to have caused this to happen. First, he is not well liked, even by his Republican colleagues in the House of Representatives. Number one, he's seen as someone who just causes chaos within the House, so that didn't help him. Number two, this pending ethics investigation, which came to a halt when he recently resigned from Congress to take a job as Attorney General, or at least to pursue the job. He was under serious ethics investigation for having sexual relations allegedly with underage girls, multiple underage girls, and allegedly paying directly or indirectly for those sexual services. And reportedly, this ethics investigation in Congress was going to be damning. It might have even resulted in calls for him to resign. So we have here a line that apparently we've hit, which is, even when we have very unqualified people, there's a line. And the line seems to be, you can't be under serious investigation for sex with minors, money laundering, paying for sex, interstate transportation of minors for sex. You can't do that and be the Attorney General of the United States.
Okay, well, we should be clear that he denies all of these allegations. I mean, do you think the evidence against him is strong? How much of it has come to light?
There's multiple witnesses in this investigation. So there's been both an FBI, Department of Justice criminal inquiry, which actually was closed on him without moving forward with charges. A close friend of his is in prison for these very same allegations, by the way, and setting up these sexual transactions. And then separately, there was this ethics investigation pending in Congress, and it's starting to leak out. We're getting pieces and a window into this, and it is quite serious. It's more serious than many people thought in terms of the money he was paying, in terms of the number of times he may have had sex allegedly with a minor. So we don't know the extent of it, and perhaps we will never know if Matt Gaetz simply goes away.
I want to talk to you a bit more about the vetting process in just a moment. Before we do that, I mean, what you said is that some in the ranks of the Republicans are probably secretly breathing a sigh of relief that Matt Gaetz is no longer the nominee. Obviously a bit of a blow, though, for Donald Trump. Do you think there was a sense that perhaps this was becoming just too much of a distraction?
Well, for certain, it was going to drag down the nomination process and split up the Republican Party within Congress. And I think they've made the right call here to withdraw Gaetz's name. But look, this is not the only problematic nominee. We have issues across the country with some of these picks that for the highest places, the highest roles in government, including Director of National Intelligence. The Secretary of Defense nominee, Peter Hegseth, has serious sexual assault allegations. So Trump is, I think, in an effort to pick loyalists who will do whatever he says, he's willing to look the other way on really troubling backgrounds on these folks. And by the way, backgrounds that are not being investigated and vetted by the FBI, because Donald Trump, unlike any other president, has chosen to bypass the standard FBI investigations, which would uncover all of this problematic threat and risk material.
Yeah, I should add that Pete Hegseth also denies those sexual assault allegations. Just going back to those FBI background checks, I mean, what you're saying is that they aren't actually compulsory.
I think it's been an eye-opening process for many Americans to see what aspects of our government we've taken for granted, we've assumed are mandated by law, and what are not. And as I have researched, a mandate for FBI background investigations on national security nominees is not law, but rather exists in a number of government documents, including what's called executive orders that date back to President Dwight Eisenhower. And then there's memoranda of understanding between the White House and DOJ, between the Senate and DOJ, that come all the way to present time. And what the intent there is clearly is that a government background investigation has to happen if you're going to get a security clearance, and all of these high-level nominees require security clearances. The intent is for the FBI and other government agencies to conduct those investigations, yet we have Donald Trump thumbing his nose at this long-standing protocol and practice. Why? Number one, I don't think he trusts the FBI. Two, he thinks his nominees have so much baggage that they would never meet the standards for a national security clearance.
Knowing, as you do, better than anyone else I can think of, how the FBI operates, just help our viewers understand someone in a much less senior position in government office would be subject, would they not, to extremely intense vetting and background checks carried out by the FBI, and therefore you'd have thought the future Attorney General as well.
So you're absolutely right. Even at any level, even at the least senior levels of government, everyone gets a form of background investigation. And as you get into the secret and top secret security clearance area, you're getting an intensive, often year-long background investigation to determine, number one, your qualifications and competency, your reputation, your trustworthiness, your loyalty to the United States, whether you might have foreign entanglements that cause concerns for national security. That happens even for the person who's pouring coffee in the coffee shop at FBI headquarters in Washington. They're getting that full-blown inquiry, and we're not getting it for people like Attorney General of the United States.
I'd imagine your former colleagues at the FBI are quite confused. They're probably scratching their heads and probably feeling a little bit worried because, you know, the word that's being used to describe a lot of these nominees is disruptors. And that suggests that they've got quite big plans for shaking things up. I mean, do you think there are plans to carry out pretty major reforms at the FBI or even dismantle it altogether?
We do expect in the United States, all of us, through some really good media reporting, we're getting insights into the plans, and they are extensive and also troubling at the same time. So this concept of disruptor, nothing wrong with shaking up bureaucracy, absolutely. But disruptor should not become destroyer. And that's where the concern is, that people seem intent on destroying the very institutions that embody America's values, the rule of law, the Constitution, 3 equal branches of government. That's going to be absolutely challenged in the months and years ahead. And for the FBI, my agency, where I spent 25 years before I retired, the talk is that we're going to see not only the FBI director fired, which, by the way, again, is a disruption because the FBI director is supposed to serve a 10-year term to straddle politics and not be political and to straddle presidential administrations. He's likely to be fired, but worse than that, they're talking about replacing the entire top echelon of the FBI, not with career agent professionals, but rather with people who are loyal to Donald Trump. And the greatest concern there would be not only that they don't know what they're doing, but also that they're willing to pursue Trump's enemies with guns and badges and use the justice process to really commit injustice.
Okay, well, turning our attention to someone who does seem to have the right qualifications, at least more so than Matt Gaetz. I want to talk to you a little bit about Pam Bondi, who has now been named as the person who's going to head up the Justice Department. Do you think it's likely she'll be confirmed easily, and do you think she has what it takes?
So it's interesting. we seem here in America to be so relieved that someone like Matt Gaetz has withdrawn from consideration that I think what happens by human nature is we're more willing to embrace the next person who has less baggage. So there's good news and there's bad news. The good news with Pam Bondi is, look, she served as Attorney General for the state of Florida, a huge state here. So that's not nothing. And in terms of qualifications, prior to that, she was actually a prosecutor at a county level in Florida. She's been a real attorney. She understands making senior legal decisions. That's good news. Bad news, she seems intensely loyal to Donald Trump. And the question will be, from some statements she is making about pursuing people who investigated Trump as part of their job, concerns me that her loyalty could be more to Donald Trump than to the Constitution. And as Attorney General, remember, your client is not the president. Your client is the American people and the Constitution.
She was named quite quickly after Gaetz withdrew from the nomination process. I'm just wondering whether your experience of covering elections and transition teams, is it quite typical that there'll be some plans B and C in place for situations just like this one?
Very traditional and typical for a president-elect to have a short list that he's willing to go to. This appears to be the number 2 choice. I hate to mention the reality here that Pam Bondi must be having some thoughts about the fact that she was second choice to a man who's who's been investigated for having sex with minors. But there she is. I will also point out, by the way, that Trump has named 2 other lawyers to serve possibly as the number 2 and number 3 at the Department of Justice, critical positions. They both have served as criminal defense attorneys in some capacity for Donald Trump, as has Pam Bondi. The good news there is that they are real serious lawyers. And I have confidence that they understand what DOJ is all about. But it is worth noting that we're looking at a scenario where the top 3 people at the U.S. Department of Justice have all potentially served as Trump's criminal defense attorneys.
Okay, yeah, so it's there are those who are saying that some of these appointments are rewards for loyalty, but that's something that's quite standard in US politics, that an incoming administration would be filled with friendly faces and people who've, in the eyes of the incumbent president, earned the loyalty of the incumbent leader. I mean, is it really so unusual that this should be happening?
There's no question, politicians being who they are, they want to surround themselves with people they trust. But I would say what separates this current scenario is the lack of serious qualifications that some of these people have. Historically in the United States, that particularly the Attorney General position has been viewed as something that has to stay sacrosanct, has to stay separate from politics and the White House. Similarly, with the FBI, Secretary of Defense should require the ability and the experience of literally running an organization of millions of employees in the Department of Defense. It's the largest employer in the U.S. government. So if you come in as a TV host, which is actually what Hegseth is, never having run a team of more than, I don't know, 4 or 5 people on your TV show, and now we're going to ask you to run up to 3 million people in your organization, I question whether that makes you qualified.
You have a role as a TV personality. I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps some of the skills associated with presenting on television and communicating to an audience are in fact quite legitimately transferable to jobs like the ones we've been talking about.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point. Trump has been very focused. And remember, Donald Trump himself is a TV star from a popular show called The Apprentice. And yes, he watches a lot of TV himself, particularly Fox News. So he's very focused on optics, appearances, and communication skills. He thinks that's gotten him where he is. And let's be realistic. He does seem to resonate with about half of the American population. And he does that through whatever form of charisma and communication he may have. And he's finding those skill sets. For example, Pam Bondi Yes, she's been Attorney General of Florida, but she has served as a media spokesperson when she was a prosecutor for her prosecutive agency. She has been on Fox News, even guest hosted on Fox News. So, he's very concerned about appearances and communication skills. It's worked for him.
Yeah, it has, because that's, one of the things that perhaps the Democrats didn't get right during the campaign. I mean, clearly some communications issues on the part of Team Harris that could have been overlooked. Just lastly, I want to ask you, the fact that we've already had one Attorney General pull out and someone else put in, whether we're looking at a repeat of some of what we saw in the first Trump presidency, which was quite high turnover. There were more than there was more than one Secretary of State, there was more than one Attorney General. I mean, do you think the second Trump presidency is going to have a similar level of turnover, or would you think that perhaps lessons were learned and perhaps if once the nomination process is over, we're going to have a little bit more stability than we did in the first team?
Well, yeah, I think so. Stability is a good thing, but why we might have stability could be problematic. And by that, I mean, you're right. Donald Trump had a lot of his top people walk away from him in his first administration because they were concerned about the ethics of their scenario, what they were being asked to do. They walked from Secretary of State and on and on and on. And I think what that means for Trump now is he's desperately seeking more loyal people to him and his cause, and less concerned about people being driven by ethics, integrity, the rule of law, that they're willing to stay around for the Trump cause. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of these selections. If I had to predict the person that might first run into an ethical dilemma, I would say that might be Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. He's a solid, experienced senator. He has chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee. He knows foreign affairs. He's been on that committee. And I think he's a pro. And I think we could be watching his relationship with Trump very carefully to see if he can hang in there as long as Trump wants him to.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Frank Figliuzzi, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.